Again, I'm not in the business of telling people what to think, but what happens if we go so far out of a desperation to win an AI arms race with China, for example, that we completely surrender the value system that supposedly makes us a freer, better society in the process? I think that is complicated.
In an interview with Impact Theory, investigative journalist Whitney Webb dives into a topic that not many would dare to discuss: the narrative that has been consistently portrayed across our media for quite some time is this notion that it's the United States versus China. It's the classic contrast between good versus evil, the ideals of the USA's democratic process, free society, and pursuit of happiness, versus China's communist state, controlled population, and forced labor. While Twitter/X is considered the town hall for our society, China's TikTok is considered a threat to our national security. And as artificial intelligence advances, the same narrative is playing out, with China's DeepSeek taking the blame for flipping the capital markets upside down temporarily. And the list of technologies and industry rivalries between the two global powerhouses is endless. However, Whitney Webb says the narrative is all an illusion to deceive the general public. Webb details how, in reality, the tech and financial oligarchs of the United States have deep ties with China, particularly China's government. Webb argues that the whole national security talking point might seem patriotic on paper, but in action, there are so many conflicts of interest for many powerful people inside of our government and corporations, dating back to the Clinton administration, who have direct interest in the growth of China, that it's almost impossible to know where one point begins and the other one ends. But nonetheless, Larry Fink and his BlackRock organization has their tentacles everywhere, as he's one of the spearheads to this globalism movement between East and West. Let's listen as Whitney breaks down what's really going on.
Would also point to the fact that transnational capital, a lot of that has enabled China's AI arms race. There is a lot of cross-pollination in these Chinese government adjacent tech corporations and the United States. You can look at people like Larry Fink, for example, who definitely have a lot of ties to Chinese industry, for example, and people like Steve Schwartzman, quite similarly, very much tied there, who's, head of Blackstone. And they're both very close personal friends of Donald Trump. And also, of course, Fink has ties to the Democrats as well. And a lot of, Henry Kissinger, who I mentioned earlier, a lot of top CCP officials have pictures of them with Henry Kissinger in their offices. They love the guy. And there was that effort, of course, to open up China to commerce and partnerships with Western companies, for example, back several decades ago. And a lot of that involved, U.S. capital and some firms like Bechtel, for example, that were very much tied to the national security state of Ronald Reagan, for example. A lot of top people that served in top national security positions under him were involved in Bechtel, which was building a lot of the infrastructure that helped enable China to become the power that it is. And why is that not being talked about? And I mean, this really isn't exclusive to Democrats either, though they often get rightly pointed out for having some conflicts of interest of this nature. But someone like Howard Lutnick, for example, who was head of the transition team for Trump and is his incoming Secretary of Commerce, has the same, his company he runs has the same tie, arguably a more direct tie, to a Chinese government majority-owned financial entity that was a big scandal for conservatives when Hunter Biden's Rosemont Seneca was also tied to it. But there's been no conservative uproar over this tie. And you have to kind of ask why that may be, and why you have a lot of these big tech people, Elon Musk included, who has a major role in the national security state of the United States, as one of the top contractors to Space Force in the Pentagon, for example, and Starlink. And all of these things, through Tesla, has a lot of ties to, Chinese commerce and tech giants that also have rather cozy relationships with the Chinese government as well. Why is that not being discussed as, a potential national security risk if we do really need to become China to beat China? You see what I'm saying? Like, if it was really, that was really the key driver of our issue, shouldn't we be scrutinizing the ties of these oligarchs to both China and, some in our own national security state? And, again, I think If people are familiar with my books and my work, there is a scandal that really exposed a lot of this that happened during the Clinton administration and was not properly investigated at all. It's remembered as Chinagate, and it was really sort of today is, I would argue, misremembered as a campaign finance scandal for the Clinton reelection campaign. But what was what was the alleged bribery of the Clinton reelection campaign meant to accomplish? And if you look at what these forces gained, what these figures gained by sort of for all intents and purposes bribing the Clinton reelection campaign, it was facilitating exports of sensitive national security technology to China, and a lot of that was done through a company called Laurel, which has since become, I think, part of Lockheed Martin. And the guy that ran Laurel at the time, Bernard Schwartz, nothing ever happened to him at all, despite the fact that he helped pass very sensitive satellites and other military technology from the U.S., directly to the Chinese military. And nothing was done about it. And he was actually a major backer of Biden in 2020. Why was that not covered? Don't you think conservatives should be all over that story? And, again, this sort of makes me concerned because I think there's not enough talk about transnational capital in these types of situations. And there's a very urgent need to go back and re-examine a lot of the past scandals of our national security state. Chinagate specifically, because as I note in my book, the death of Commerce Secretary Ron Brown and a lot of people at the ITA Department at Commerce, those were the most people targeted as this bribery scandal at Chinagate, because the Commerce Department oversees the export of sensitive technology to foreign powers, right? And the fact that most of the employees that knew about that scandal were all essentially blown up in the same aircraft accident, and that Ron Brown had a bullet hole in his head when his body was discovered in the plane. Okay. Why has that not been? Well, it's true. You can look at the evidence, and it's absolutely there. And, why can't we examine this? And shouldn't it be disturbing that the incoming head of the Commerce Department has a direct tie to the Chinese government in the context of that type of scandal of Chinagate and targeting the Commerce Department specifically?
We've heard Webb mention the ties between political and business leaders in the West with China's growth and evolution in many sectors in the East. Webb dives deeper into this concept, identifying ties between the Clintons, the Maxwells, and other powerful, well-connected families. Whitney's most glaring observation that we all should be asking is, why is that? You'll have a better understanding of the importance of that question after Whitney breaks down what's truly going on behind the curtain. Let's listen to what Whitney has to say.
Well, so I would argue that one of the reasons, or what we can look to as sort of one of the markers of this whole trend beginning of this sort of bleeding of national security state issues between countries when it really doesn't make any sense. An example I like to bring up is a man named Samuel Pisar. You may know him as the stepfather of Anthony Blinken. He was also a prominent lawyer for big tech companies and a lot of other corporations. Also a very good friend and close relation to Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. And he was very active in what he said was sort of smoothing over relationships between East and West during the Cold War. But essentially what he said in testimony to Congress in the early 70s is that there was the rise of what he called the trans-ideological corporation, where you essentially have the multinational corporations, many of them based in the West, making joint ventures with the communist-owned, state-owned enterprises in the East, Russia and China, and that these were essentially fusing to form an economic structure that was unaccountable to any government in the world. And when asked if he thought this development was a good thing, he essentially said, yes, it was. And that was back in the early 1970s. And nothing was really done about it. And you have to kind of ask why is that? And it's kind of interesting too for those that subscribe to the thesis of someone like Carol Quigley, who wrote many decades ago about this idea of the roundtable groups and all of that. sort of coming from Cecil Rhodes and Britain, and efforts to sort of remake the British Empire at a global scale through covert means, they essentially, that thesis essentially argues about creating an unaccountable economic entity as the means to doing that, a blob, if you will. That's probably the easiest way to understand it. And essentially, I think what we have arrived at as a consequence of that type of behavior and situation is a situation where we essentially have the nation states acting as enabling environments for policies that are often drafted at the international level by think tanks. And I'm sure the most notorious of those are things like the World Economic Forum, but there's the Council on Foreign Relations, there's Chatham House, there's CSIS. I mean, there's a lot of these entities around. And, oftentimes Congress people aren't really directly writing the policies they're voting on. They're handed laws. And a lot of sometimes those are developed from these think tanks, which are funded largely by multinational corporations, and sometimes, directly by big tech oligarchs like Bill Gates, for example. And those are sort of, shopped not just, in one country, but oftentimes in multiple countries. And so you sort of get multiple countries agreeing to enact the same policy framework for a variety of things. Some people have argued that's why, essentially globally, there was sort of lockstep agreement about what policies to enact in the situation of COVID-19. And also why, ostensible adversaries like Russia, China, the United States, most of the West, all agree about the, sustainable development goals of the United Nations, which if you actually look into the SDGs, a lot of it is about sort of pushing us into this fourth industrial revolution where life becomes increasingly digitized and increasingly surveillable. And really, I would ultimately argue is about the creation of new markets at the end of the day. And a lot of the push for digital ID is in that. And that's why some have argued that this is sort of a policy that's being implemented globally. And it is true, digital ID in particular, sort of, I think the first time most people heard about it might have been in COVID-19. But in the post-COVID era, digital ID has made, has been popping up essentially in every country around the world. So has surveillable, programmable, and seizable money, whether in the form of CBDC or its private sector equivalents. And I think it's fair to say that, in countries like United States, where they don't want to have a CBDC, for example, private sector is going to produce it. And they've done that in many occasions to make it sort of, I think, more palatable. To a more liberty-minded public. It's not coming from the state, it's coming from the private sector, but ultimately, the end result in the policy is essentially the same. And so, in a sense, yes, I guess some would argue that is globalism in a nutshell. And technocracy, which I mentioned earlier, was an actual movement. And that particular movement built around this organization called Technocracy, Inc., which the Canadian branch of which was led by Elon Musk's grandfather. That argued for the creation of all these different unions around the world, these different techniques, like a European Union, an African Union, a North American Union, etc. And that the goal was to sort of push that, some have argued, via the idea of this multipolar world, where you're sort of ending the unipolar model. And I think that's, essentially what has happened, essentially.
To watch the full interview, check out the link in the description. What are your thoughts on what Whitney had to say? Do you think her points are valid, or is she reaching? Leave a comment. SIM swap fraud is sweeping the globe, and your mobile security is at risk. Switch to Ifani and lock out SIM swap fraud and get the most elite mobile protection in the world. Ifani guarantees 100% protection from SIM swaps, backed by a $5 million insurance policy. Stay secure with reliable coverage, free international roaming, and unlimited data. Trust Ifani to keep your communications and assets secured. Get military-grade protection, 24/7 concierge service, and a hassle-free upgrade. Click the link below for $150 off. Thanks for watching. Help support this channel and receive exclusive offers from one of our partners located in the description. We'll see you on the next one.